It was a time of cocaine and black market weapons, satellites and dew stations. The captain sat at a table smoking a hookah, sipping mint tea and chomping on pine nuts. He had eaten a plate of chicken earlier, seasoned with lemons and cinnamon. His stomach bubbled with delight, his lust for opium growing stronger by the hour. He belched and took his last hit of the hookah, the sweet smoke nourishing his yearning. He would abstain, choosing instead to buy a brick of hashish and head back to his hotel room. He felt a strong urge to masturbate, trying to hide his heart on as he made his way down the crowded street, hoping to God he didn't bump into anyone. The captain retreated to his hotel, feeding for his collection of Hustler magazines in his Jansport backpack. He locked the door, his blood running strong, achieving a teenage thrill. He had been at sea far too long. After spending an hour with his smut, he decided to venture out into the night once more. He had recovered from an addiction to whores after a bout of gonorrhea. That pushed the envelope too far for him. He had awful memories of the gonorrhea, but he couldn't quite say the same about his time with the whores. Even Jesus made room for whores in his life. Maybe he was getting ahead of himself, maybe not. He headed for the bar, his balls aching. He ordered a Boilermaker and took a seat near the front door, the night air swirling in secret serenades. He had long been a creature of the night, even while at sea. He barely slept, 3 hours good enough. The hash came on slow, sneaking up on him like a ghost, making the Duke in the background drone in sweet poetry. It was here in this ancient city where there was always a lamp burning somewhere for the beasts of the somber Atlantic. Port cities of the ages, forever steeped in forlorn memories of old. Recycled sin where God and the devil crossed paths to wager their might. His first night on land was going to as expected, appreciating the privacy and the freedom of wandering solo throughout the back streets with no crew in tow, managing to keep his hotel a secret, everything going as planned. For it was on this night that he would fake his own death and disappear into the desert at dawn, his guide Abdullah, nothing like Abdullah, likely rolling about in dreams, set up to meet the captain in the morning. He would make his way to Greece through Algeria, longing for wine and sun, the sparkling vibrations of the Mediterranean lulling him from the years of running Chinese freighters around the southern coast of Africa. He took a long toke off of his spliff, the hashish crackling and the smoke trailing into his eye, making it water. He sat in his hotel room, listening to the couple next door make headway in their bout of rough sex while he sat on the crapper, dreaming of his estranged lovers. His balls were drying up and his mind was fading fast. All he wanted to do was paint houses for a living and come home to a beautiful and loving woman. With any luck, the Chinese government would resist tracking him down and forcing him to finish out his contract. Chinese prison was not for the meek. He made himself at home, drawing the bath and closing the curtains, puffing on a spliff rolled in Bali shag and tainted in hashish and keef. He took his clothes off, climbing in the half-full bath, laying into it and wetting his hair. Suddenly he felt a strong urge to urinate, seeing no use in getting up from the warm bath, beginning to empty his bladder, the water laced in streaks of yellow. He felt at one unscrewing the cap of shampoo and scrubbing his greasy hair clean. He had not showered in several days while at the mercy of navigating severe weather. He would not sleep, as he was set to meet Abdullah in merely 2 hours, who would guide him on his way toward Algeria. They would travel by way of private truck operated by Abdullah, a Toyota Yamaha 003. The captain stood at the mirror, applying bar soap to his face and reaching for his razor. He noticed his hair turning gray, his stomach growing large, lack of exercise, and a poor diet. In just days he would be longing for the sea, inland, and baking in the heat, getting spit on by camels and scowled at by locals along the side of the road. He was a sore thumb in a poverty-stricken land where the people were as rugged as the earth beneath their feet, chafed and battered. Abdullah arrived early, and the two made their way out of town through the winding streets. The men on the ship began to worry when, after roll call, the captain was nowhere to be found, his quarters empty. Nobody had seen him since they had disembarked the freighters than the day before. His spirit felt free, and he let in the subtle breeze through the open window, the salt of the ocean riding on the wind, slowly fading into a hammering of desert sun. Houses on the side of the road looking dilapidated and cold with the hammering of poverty and all that strips the soul into leaving us nothing more than a shivering condor, plucked of all its feathers. Where once we were strong, we learned to be weak. We learned that we could not fly. Our dreams would likely never come true. The stale realities of the journey, tapered in rice paper and burning rubber tires. The captain took a long drink out of his canteen. The gallon jugs of water tucked neatly in the back seat. Abdullah always armed himself on these highways, the Kalashnikov hanging in the window on the back of the Toyota. He produced a chillum from his vest pocket and took a long pull, holding it in and swallowing it, then blowing it out the window and quietly coughing. He was a seasoned pothead. Abdullah spoke nearly perfect English, so it was quiet. He found Westerners to be showy and entitled. In truth, he had not made up his mind on what he thought of the captain, sensing that the man was running away from something and had made him the road dog. The captain had assured him that this was a simple road trip that he had been planning since he was young, tracing his fingers along the globe in his fifth grade classroom, where Africa and Europe were light years away. The captain was Alaskan, forever fascinated by all it was to leave the cubbyhole of darkness in the north, to find himself traipsing distant and ancient cities, walls caked in layers of time and distant wars of man. All was a jigsaw puzzle, each one of us fitting in there somewhere and somehow. Abdullah was piloting the Toyota toward Ouija, a border town with Morocco and Algeria. The captain's final destination was Algiers, where he would take a passenger ferry. It would be crowded and hot, yet the discomfort was merely temporary, all things passing as they must. This whirl of the seasons, the death rattle of grandfathers, daughters, mothers, sons, all was a matter of chance. The two stopped for lunch at a small roadside cafe serving lamb, camel's milk, and bottomless mint tea. The ice in the water risking the runs for outsiders. The captain had drank from giardia-ridden streams in the high mountains all his life. He had drank from creeks across the globe, never succumbing to any stomach troubles. His immunity was strong, which left one to question, was there a secret to a man who drank tuna water? His shipmates regarded him as Johnny Tuna behind his back, their playful vision of his strange and questionable quirks. His real name was Jonathan Kowalski. How he had ended up captaining Chinese freighters was a long drawn-out story left for a rainy night. For now, it was the thrill of losing himself, now regarded as a missing person and operating under a counterfeit Canadian passport to throw off any family back in the States or Chinese government tracking him down. His trail had gone cold back in Tangier, and there was nothing that could be done. The ship had to maintain a schedule, and the first mate took over, the vessel disembarking from the harbor, northward to Spain and onward to the United Kingdom. The vessels he captained had been under investigation as of late, the hulls rumored to be ridden with ivory and rhino horns, heroin and black market poppies. One container on the vessel was stacked ceiling to floor and wall to wall with electronic typewriters, 2 kilos each stuffed inside the guts of each machine. He longed for his estranged wife in silent moments like this. The crimson desert wafting by the sides of the road, the distant glow of the sea glimmering on the horizon, the low hum of the engine climbing a mountain pass in third gear. They had married young, she 22 and he 23. They had been sitting on the couch watching Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan. She had turned to him after a long silence and exclaimed, "Will you marry me?" Without question, he replied, "Yes." Their love blooming and dying like African lilies in the seething heat. Jonathan could see supplies being delivered to a dye factory behind the restaurant, pools of color, a technicolored rainbow of ancient wisdom. Ghosts lived here in these spaces, these quiet spaces. Their spirits linger like a membrane, coating the mind and spirit. The captain lit a Dunhill and held in the smoke for a long moment, offering one to Abdullah, who graciously accepted it, tucking it into his turban to smoke after his dinner. They were traveling along Route RN2, the highway faster and less dangerous than Route RN16, a popular route he wished to avoid due to wanting to travel through the desert after so long at sea, seemingly coming to the realization that the two were beasts, both one and the same, exhibiting their own forms of danger and equal parts flirtation with the scythe of death. This was a man's type of land, far away from a future of millennial triggers and overall baby bitch ribs of an existence. Meek and trivial wasted youth, Generation I, now the final swan song of the civilization in rapid decline. Mother Earth is infected with a cancer, searing like hot grits deep in her core. The mother is weeping, and the many dance fancy and swell in their wealth and consumption, pollution, their toxic everything, making you slobber with glee like biting into a freshly peeled mango. All was for the taking, and the captain wanted none of it. The Chinese mob had no pull in North Africa, and thus he had chosen the perfect escape route. Santorini would be his new home, the climate of the Aegean Sea, sure to ease his creaking bones and crooked spine. He had a large sum of money saved in a Swiss bank account, which he had never existed with anyone. Christ, who was there to share anything with? He had awoken to the border crossing, and now climbing back out of sleep once more, the road growing closer to Algiers and true freedom. Abdullah changed the radio station till he found a track playing the Beach Boys. He left it there, making John chuckle. Abdullah finally spoke. "Are you an ass man or a boob man?" John burst out laughing, finding Abdullah's attempt at relating to him in English with such vulgarity. Entertaining his driver, John replied, "I'll take the whole buffet, man." Abdullah spoke once more. "I wouldn't mind coming home to Dolly Parton." The captain laughed. It was always the quiet ones he had been told to look out for, and Abdullah was one of those shining examples. John inquired, "Are you married?" Abdullah replied, "To a queen, the mother of my children." John smiled wide, the pride in Abdullah's voice strong and pure. John had always wanted children, yet knew in his heart he would never be a father. Such was the crumbling of the cosmic influx. Although only sleeping for an hour, he felt revitalized. He would feel better once he was at sea once more. He longed for the sea, for he came from a people ripe to its splendor, crafting seafaring vessels out of sea mammal intestines, stretched around pieces of driftwood. His grandfather he had never met had been a man of the sea, a Dutch sailor who was refused by his grandmother as a husband, for he was a Catholic, and she a staunch Christian, the Catholic faith making her blood burn a brighter shade of red. The lights of Algiers, like a fire cast in the midnight sky, his mind wandered and was astray, stuck in a rut and ruminating on the sun burning out the sky and life on earth ceasing to exist. Why try sometimes, he thought. What was the bother, and all for what? To kiss the earth goodnight, to be smited down with a clap of an asteroid? These thoughts were accompanied by an extreme loneliness which haunted his inner marrow. His relationships had all come and gone in uproar, and he wished now to simply live as a monk, a man on his own and bound to end up with someone at some place and some time. He had never sought out lovers, they had just fallen into his lap. Some of his relationships were long, others short-lived. All in all, he had always dated women far more intelligent than him. He was indebted to all of them, and somehow, in some way, for it was they who had tolerated him and quieted his mind, to teach him a thing or taught him a thing or two about a thing or two, whether in the basement, whether in the bedroom, or bushwhacking in the mighty forests of the sequoia. He had lived most everywhere since his high school graduation, the first half of his life filled with an equal amount of travel, from city to town to apartment to house. He sparked his lighter, raising it to his Dunhill, remembering the beaches of Galveston, the taste of salt in the air. He recalled nights falling asleep on mushrooms to the sound of a stereo recording of a beach, an 8-hour-long loop which lulled him into dreams, their bodies spent from making love and swilling wine, lying in the bath together and smiling in the glow of the tea candles. Martyr's Memorial glistened in the desert heat of night, the Hamad Garden dating back to 1832, colorful courtyards swirling with birds and the sway of palms, the Kasbah of Algiers, children playing soccer in the streets, dye pools, and far in the distance, French architecture bathed in the waning sun. He would take the ferry to Naples, a city of mania, flying onward to Santorini. He would drive down the coast to Sorrento to spend a few days, taking full advantage of the tourist off-season. He remembers Sorrento and Naples from his childhood. Naples, a city of danger and psychotic cab drivers looking to rip you off. Everyone, everything, a scam. Keep your money in your bra. He lusted for the sweet nectar of lemon grappa, fresh from the freezer and on the rocks. The very thought of the scent of the booze making his mouth water like the Mississippi. He longed for tomorrow, forever done with living his life in the past. He had bloomed in that way, learning to cherish the moment, the breath, and the silence, the sound of blood rushing in your ears like the pattering of a spider across the ribbon mic. He bit into a sardine sandwich, the smell on his breath making Abdullah crack the window, despite the working air conditioner. He was vegetarian and sickened by the devouring of meat. Even fish, believing eating animals would cause him to ingest the same pain the animal felt the day it was slaughtered. He believed in this force of nature, an underlying current, a main line to the bathhouses of the gods. The boat to Naples left early the next morning, and the captain was once again pulling an all-nighter. He sparked another Dunhill, breathing deep. The fresh breeze came in through the window of the hookah bar, the night clambering into morning. Finally, he was left wandering the city streets till making his departure down at the Port d'Alger. His lungs burned from too many cigarettes, and once situated on the passenger ferry, he cracked a beer and poured it into a water bottle. It soothed his chaotic mind with his inability to risk smuggling drugs across the border. The city streets of Europe were forever ripe with butane hash dreams, THC lullabies. The sea swelled, slowly rocking in the current. His head lay atop his knapsack, falling into deep dreams. Conversation and crying children surrounding him, hooting and hollering, laughing and sighing. All was at one in that moment. Naples was a city of night and the captain a professor in self-destruction. A city of siesta, the streets slim and empty, clothes hanging from windows, laughter ringing out over afternoon wine. Abdullah had spoken illy of Naples. A toilet next to a supervolcano, he called it. John had laughed, taking to the streets where Madonna sat in glass and the graffiti surrounding her. The streets deserted by dawn, interconnected, dreaming civilians, rams firing as the people tossed and turned, waking late and sauntering into work. The city of dreams. He rode via bus northward to Sorrento in the following days, heading to Rome to make his way to Athens and further onward to the stretch of Santorini. He was promised a flat and a part-time job doing commercial painting. Not many Alaska natives had ever come to live in the southern islands of Greece. Not many Alaska natives had ever been to Europe. The captain had led an odd life, from apartments to three-bedroom homes, from the two-door Nissan to the four-door Ford Explorer. His mind felt ripe and his heart in full bloom, forever longing for the freedom of responsibilities to an employer. In particular, the leering microscope of the Chinese mafia. He had met a Brit on the boat who garnished many a mini bottle, and the two thus became fast friends. The Brit had smuggled some hash on the ship and offered a toke to the captain, who was relishing the joy of traveling at sea carefree, finding himself free of the stress and enjoying himself. The captain in the cockpit would endure stress so that the voyagers did not have to. The captain had longed for this, sun and drink and vulgarity, the pitfalls of a man living amidst a midlife crisis. For the love of God, he thought. He still had several more checkpoints where his counterfeit passport needed to pass and his fake visa displayed to officers of the border guard. The Brit went by the name Mongo and had cracked up with the captain about the two of them being the only ones on the ship who knew what Zero skateboards was. Mongo having the Zero skull on his forearm, he picked up on the island of Kauai, where a tattoo parlor was operating out of Lihue. He had lived on the islands for a year, surfing and photographing his travels. The captain admired his well-versed sarcasm, the two wishing they were neighbors after just hours together. These people are rare and sometimes only with us a short time, and thus must we make the most of every day. Who knows what tomorrow brings? He had visited the Grappa distillery, the lemons still lining the window, in operation over 150 years. Sorrento was one of those places that got into your blood immediately. The beach was deserted, the pedal boats stacked high behind fencing, and the open spaces below the tall cliffs where the hotel was gracing the shoreline. One of maybe 10 visitors in a 300-room hotel. Ballrooms empty, dining hall deserted, save for a few families eating breakfast. The Mediterranean winter kept the large flocks of tourists far away in their domiciles of fading love and the exhaustion of life. He stared into the distance, sipping a macchiato and smoking a Dunhill. The sea was varnished in a blanket of teal. the sun beaming down upon his face and the salty wind blowing through his damp hair. Lost in the break of the waves against the shoreline and crashing against the rocks. He was transfixed by the splendor of it all, slowly taking a seat and kicking off his shoes. His mind drifted to traveling the back roads through the great Smoky Mountains in winter, the rolling hills of West Virginia. A humidity hung in the room, a ceiling fan steadily humming. Distant laughter carried through the hotel, shorebirds tracing the clouds, circling the harbor like leeches of the sky. The fishermen's nets were full, their hearts light as they slowly trolled through the harbor. He hitched a ride in a hired van with some couples he met at the hotel. They were traveling north toward Rome. Luckily, the lot of them had already seen Pompeii, so they would not need to stop. The captain preferred Pink Floyd's Live at Pompeii far more than he did walking around looking at dead people. Humans, they love a good horror story. Taking the captain by surprise, the song Miracles by Jefferson Starship came streaming in over the van stereo system. The captain felt at one, an old jam of his he used to spin on vinyl. Luckily, the members of the van were classic rock fans, and they set to debating where exactly Styx fit into the map of the 80s mainstream rock and roll circuit. The van was stuffy, and he cherished the wind spewing through the open windows as they wound their way north, the temperature increasing as they moved further inland. The captain took a quick hit off his chillum and blew it out the window. The others in the van absorbed in the conversation. They didn't even notice. Next, he reached for his water bottle, taking a nice long pull. It was a transparent red water bottle filled to the brim with vino. It hit the spot, the company of the young travelers now beginning to irk him. They would be in Rome soon, and he free to never see them again. Thus he remained calm. He had learned to control himself over the years. Conflict had its place, just not in everyday life. He had learned to become a man of silence. Once a drunken preacher, stripped of everything, he became a monk. Finally, the outskirts of Rome began to rise up from the distance, buildings becoming larger, highways intersecting, drivers speeding maniacally and powered by espresso and strong cigarettes, vino. The captain was staying in a modest yet beautiful hotel just around the corner to the Vatican. It was old, yet well kept, in operation for over 200 years. He opened the giant windows, looking down into the streets below, mopeds roaring through the days and cutting through the nights. Beautiful women sauntered the sidewalks in soft red dresses and long curly brown hair, their skin olive, high cheekbones radiating in the falling sun. It was those rare moments where he longed for a partner, having no one to share the laughter, the bottle of wine, the tears and the arguments. It was in the arguments where all was forever lost. Drunken blowouts, screaming, getting bombarded and could have, should have. At times he wondered what had become of him had he never left the village. Would he have become a father at 16? Would he have learned to fill his freezer up with fresh meat and berries to get through the cocoon of winter? So much remained unanswered, forever an outsider and always aloof. He pulled out the cork of the wine bottle, pouring his glass nice and tall, feasting on a tray of antipasta. He turned on the radio. Suddenly the voice of Roy Orbison came streaming out of the 50s tube radio. He raised his glass to the ghosts, taking a long swill. The night was balmy, and he slept atop the blankets, naked and free, the midnight air and looming madness of night swirling through the room in slow motion. Distant dreams, nightmares. The night sky, glowing in sweet purple, the cities rumbling in ancient laughter, the traces of ghosts in Hadrian's library. He would spend one night there before his journey south to Santorini. rising out of the Aegean Sea like a beacon of hope. He noticed his appetite had been shot, the stress of travel weighing on him like a basket of coal to be carried up the mountain to the bathhouses of the gods. He pecked at food, preferring pastries over nourishment. The bread soothed his acidic gut, forever hammered by Thor and lucid demons, swilling mineral water and pouring grappa into his latte. Athens was alive, political unrest quivering below the surface and painted across the walls in anti-government sentiment. Anarchy signs abound, blemishes upon the marble of miscontent. Blemished upon the marble of miscontent empires. The Adonia is an ancient Greek festival held by the women of Greece to mourn the death of Adonis, a mortal lover of the goddess Aphrodite in Greek mythology, traced to the 1st century AD. He was an outsider here, more so than in Rome, he felt. He had forever stuck out in one form or another, dressing strangely and only wearing used clothing, most of it from the 70s. He loved to people watch. A man passing him reminded him of a friend who went by Big Mike and owned a 1987 Buick Century. It was beyond trash. The floors littered in stale French fries and various forms of garbage from fast food joints, complete with a plastic basket from Skipper's. The elderly man holding hands with the middle-aged one, lovers on holiday from Berlin, fountains of the night, the cool air piping in from the shore, the glimmer of the Aegean Sea ancient and foreboding. Ships bobbed in the darkness of the harbor, a fluorescent glow of street lamps, fist fighting with the stars. Earlier he had hit up the market, scoring some hash from a trusting local spotted on a bench. The captain could sniff out a dealer like a canine. A trusting dealer was key, many as such taking full advantage of weary tourists. Addicts made a living stealing wallets and purses in these markets. He was a fiend for baklava, and he had brought several pieces back to his hotel. The night was still young, still partying high schoolers upstairs, tossing items from the hotel room and beer cans at motorists. It reminded him of his youth in Spain, a friend of him requesting he bring back a piece of Europe. On his last night in Barcelona, he kicked a toilet dispenser off the wall and took it back to his room in a knapsack, which was filled with porn. Upon his return to the States, he knocked on the door of the friend who had requested a piece of Europe, presenting him with a toilet paper dispenser. The two had laughed, the piece placed high on a shelf. He would take the ferry from Athens to Santorini, a journey taking 8 to 10 hours. He would stay drunk, the time passing in a haze. His mind drifted back to his youth during a growth spurt. He could barely walk due to the deformity in his spine, spending his days and nights lying in bed watching Cheech and Chong on TBS, Matlock in the afternoon. He had made contact with Pierre, a French national from Montreal. Pierre traveled between Santorini and Strasbourg, where he often exhibited his work. He was a man of mystery, his occupation and funding raising questions. The captain was not one to pry, and had been in contact with Pierre over a year, thus building a bridge of trust between the two. He was a man on the inside, setting up living arrangements with locals. He was paid well for his work, the captain having never lived in one place for very long. His life spent at sea and his childhood one dwelling in one city to the next. The ferry hit rough water, delaying the voyage by an hour or so, the whitecaps bitter and unforgiving. He recalled far back to his boyhood racing across Kobuk Lake in a Boston whaler, the hull hammering the lake like Thor, grasping his hammer and laughing like a jackal. The hunter at the helm increasing the speed, laughing at him, curled up in the bow, hanging on for dear life while he faced the wind, only turning his back to it when he would light a Marlboro with a single match. A seasoned captain, one who John had admired dearly. The hunters were hard-boiled and confusing, tossing their litter into the passing current of the river. On the ferry he had met a mother and daughter from Indianapolis, Hoosiers for good measure. The mother's name was Sarah, her hair blonde and long, eyes turning into slants when she smiled, looking like a mixed native girl from back home. The two had taken many adventures from Jamaica to Fiji. The daughter was quiet, journaling in her diary and lost in daydreams. The captain sensed a savage father figure, yet did not speak on it, divorce forever a sore subject. The three sat in the galley, gazing across the horizon through the large windows, comfortable in a shared silence. Silence came from his family. Strange and silent Dutch Germans, the other half Alaska natives of the Northwest Arctic, the Inupiaq people. It is of Inupiaq fashion to garnish and harbor, to honor all that it is to be silent. To be silent is to ingest, to learn, to understand. White men fill that empty space together to discuss small, minute, matterless philosophies or subjects of heated debate, their speech sounding like cats fighting compared to the slow pace of a people living at the speed of whale calls. Inupiaq silence can be as unbearable as the first time in a sweat lodge. It takes a certain type of patience to live life in this way. His mind turned in a memory of his divorce, his ex-wife filling up the fridge and freezer with garbage, emptying the apartment of furniture and records, the blinds missing, the dog gone. Darwin's bark spider, silk 10 times stronger than Kevlar. That's how he had to be back then, hard-boiled, drinking malt liquor and crashing in a dark, black mold-infused basement in a house destined to finally be torn down. He drove a 1966 Volvo 122S, a Volvo Amazon, 4 doors and airplane seatbelts. It was battered and red where it was not chipped and rusted. He drove it to work daily, late and on the backside of East Madison Street, the pedal to the floor, the motor pissing and growling. On many a night he tripped on mushrooms till early morning, calling in sick and spending the afternoon swilling Red Stripe and Genesee. There was a fridge in the basement, the 3 shelves continually stocked with High Life bottles. His Kush connection at the time was solid, the days before the legalization of marijuana. Government dope, tumbled into keef and sold to the customer at half the terpene content. The lights of Santorini bled atop the cliffs leading down to the sea. An onyx of luring hauntings, tiny streets crammed together like wooden matches. The speed of the town was just right for the captain. A mix of lively partying, bars, markets and boutiques, bakeries, pickpockets. Palm trees and ferns lined the white stone walls. Much of and most of the city was only walkable, the back alleys too skinny, even for mopeds and cyclists. He had only owned 2 cars in his life, and even then, only in brief stretches. He was a man of the water, finding car enthusiasts to be rich, egotistical assholes. It was a city brimming with life. The roar of human conversation replacing the roar of motorists and heavy traffic. It was a paradise for a man like the captain. The city streets jolly and filled with couples on holiday, and locals trying desperately to siphon their euros with a smile and endearing laughter. These were good people, far different than the hostiles of Athens, where the streets had been lined in graffiti and civil unrest, bubbling near the surface like a newly formed lava tube. He awoke early in the morning in his modestly furnished apartment, a foam mattress on the floor, a rocking chair, a table and a clock radio. He was pooling sweat, the air humid with rain and a possible fever picked up along his journey. He had lit a cigarette that morning and then rushed to the bathroom to vomit. All was not well, and he sat with the window wide and the sound of rain gushed in from the deserted streets. He took a large toke from his chillum. He coughed and then slowly his stomach came to a halt, and he put on some coffee. He had not been up this early since he used to work an old job assisting the homeless stay clean, a nonprofit geared at free showers and laundry. The front lines of social work, the many burn out and fade quickly. The seasoned stay drunk and at the command, fighting a war that will never be won. Thus he had joined the merchant marines and began his life on ships, on the open sea where he felt free of country and all that it was to be a daily fucking citizen, a bored bastard thrilled by 3D movies and fleshlights, self-serving assholes of the third kind, parasites, committed wholeheartedly to their own molecular downfall, the fatal flaw of man. The belief that he could rival any god, tame any season, inhabit any planet without destroying it. A salty goddamn mess. He was raised in homes where everyone smoked cigarettes and drank vodka and whiskey and wine. These were the baby boomers, seemingly all of them to avoid ever becoming hippies in the 60s and 70s. They flew straight, aside from his father, who was a loner in a leather jacket with a motorcycle. Even then, he was tame, working a full-time job starting at age 9. The captain had flown in these footsteps, becoming a paperboy at age 12. His route was the Capitol Building and Federal Building in Juneau, Alaska, where the tourists lingered the downtown streets in the summer and the politicians bashed it out in the session halls during the winters. The town filling up with people for session, who then returned home once their service had been complete. This was an age of subsistence being on the grounds for vote, and pro-subsistence lobbyists came to drink with his mother and father, crab feasts and grilling salmon on the porch. He had loved these parties because it allowed him to steal beer. Even at 14, he drank on average a beer every day. He had poured with sweat, and he turned on the fan, needing to fish his thermometer out of his bag. The coffee was pure, gathered from high in the Ethiopian mountains, and flowery in aroma and taste. His family life had been strange, almost to riches to rags to rags to riches. His bipolar disorder made sense, although he had been off his meds for many years, citing medical cannabis as his only needed medicine. For overseas trips, he was even prescribed Marinol. He lay in the heat recalling a dreary night in Seattle after drinking absinthe, when he kicked the psilocybin dealer out of his shack for proclaiming that the N-word was just a word, that it had no meaning. His blood pressure had skyrocketed and he stood up, his voice booming, his hand shaking on the verge of socking the Eastern Washington hick in the mouth. Thus it came the end of his psilocybin hookup, which was later restored, no longer having to depend on AC40DMT, synthetic psilocybin which blasted him into another solar system and caused bad trips, lying on the floor with a blanket on his head, having to reverse the trip with a 1 milligram tablet of Risperdal. Those were heavy times, a heavy life. By nightfall, he had normalized, spending much of the afternoon in bed where it was safe. The heat subtle in the pumice construction, his burning temperature gone, likely caused by the dream. He sat upright, sipping tea, thinking about his girlfriend who was in the movie theater with him, who ditched him. He looked behind him and much to his surprise sat his Anna, his grandmother, her sewing bag at her side wearing a red felt coat. He wrapped his arms around her, closing his eyes. From deep within she beamed upon his spirit like a supernova. Then he woke up. He poured more iced tea into his glass, taking a long toke off his chillum, reaching for more hash and tobacco to repack the bowl. the clay body of the bowl still hot. This was the way of the Sufi, one way anyway. It was a day of reflection, grappa on the rocks, ginger tea for his aching stomach further irritated by booze. He remembered in jail, sleeping in a room full of men on mats similar to dog beds. He was delusional, completely spun on his own voices, ecstatic in his head, under the impression the man lying next to him was going to smother him in his sleep. He had dove upon the man, going straight for his throat. They rushed him into a cell after he shouted, "You raped my sister-in-law." He was a wreck, and it was his lost year in the legal system. He was young then, the charges expunged, and thus he traveled the open sea and the distant oceans beyond once more. Many a seaman not faring well on land, however, after enough time. He longed for psilocybin taffy to set his mood straight and his spirit realigned. In due time, he told himself, mushrooms had their way of magically showing up in his life. The next morning he awoke feeling reborn, making his way into the market for much-needed sustenance. He would furnish his apartment slowly, with great thought put into each item, whereas in years prior he had been somewhat of a hoarder, with a stockade of food and water. He lived more simply now, existing wholeheartedly in one room. He had lived in cottages for years, and thus the changes to an apartment was a big step. Now no longer fearing hearing voices through the wall, although there was still something to be said for having the hearing of a hunter, forever pondering the fine line between voices and their truths. The men at the Grappa distillery were jolly and filled with life, likely nipping at the nectar as they served their customers, mostly visitors and occasional local, requiring no taste test but accepting it with a warm heart all the same. He was still recovering from his journey, spending long hours in bed and dreaming, waking up at 3:30 p.m. to put on coffee and lit a morning cigarette, facing the east and praying to the Creator. It was taboo to pray for himself, the difference between red and white spirituality. An ancient volcano had upset Thera some 3,600 years ago, ending the Minoan civilization on Crete. The ash layer hundreds of meters deep. He took a sip of his ouzo, his body spent from a day's work. It had been a day job. He and a partner named Tesos finished quickly, the captain fitting right in, his skin an olive brown, his hair long and dark. Wine in Santorini was made with garlands, grapes trained to grow in a circle atop the arid soil, floral and painted by the sun. It was said the saddest thing about Santorini was the drink prices along the cliff overlooks, Brits on holiday, Germans being obnoxious, the odd Irishman, the Danish weaklings of everywhere, foxhole prayers of the morning after. He took a long bath that night, soaking in Epsom salts. He popped a 10 milligram tablet of Valium for good measure, taking in a long drag of his spliff and reaching for a candle, placing it along the edge of the bathtub. The lights in the apartment, now entirely turned out, spare the lone candle, flickering across the walls like cavemen painting at night in the breast of winter. He was lulled into a dreamlike state of mind, reaching for his vino and taking a big bite of bread with butter to soak up the tannins. His gut was angry with him. He made his way from the bath, moving to the balcony and staring at lamp posts, clambering the escalator toward the stars, to the moon and back again, a magical rainbow of gravity and the pull of the tides, electric vibrations of true midnight. The climate was good for his joints, and the light proved a well-needed dose of vitamin D. He felt happier there, maybe more happy than he could seem to recall feeling anywhere. His anxiety on the ship after burning out could only be curbed by the flask stapled to his heart beneath his herringbone fisherman's jacket. Many a captain had succumbed to day drinking to cope with the stress, liquid courage being their sole ally. Thus was formed the secret pact of a functioning alcoholic, oblivious to all but the most seasoned of drunks, for which there had always formed a bond. They were nothing to be feared, their hearts in the right place, and their spirits merely wounded. The captain's spirit had been amputated a decade or so before arriving in Santorini. It was there in the Aegean empires of teal waters and ancient gods that he began to become filled with light once more, the echoes of laughter filling the streets, which were wafting in glorious smells from blooming flowers to sizzling lamb and fresh fish, a whole fiesta of aromas, sights, sounds, and dreams. This was a peaceful kingdom, he thought, a utopia compared to the horse stalls of his life. He kept seeing a woman, usually in the afternoon. She would return home an hour after him, looking worn and had an aura of sadness to her. She had long been keen to settling with salty women, sad and bitter with it all. From fighting like cats and dogs to smothered in hugs, he longed for the comfort of a woman at times, and he felt drawn and almost ashamed of his seemingly stalkerish crush. The truth was, the streets were small and the town compressed. All was forever under a microscope. Thus he shamelessly carried on with his school crush. All the effort it took to maintain average relationships, even with friends, had always been a challenge for him. He was a loner with the heart of a lion and the shell of a crab. Maybe that's why he didn't like getting too close to people. For once they figured out his weak spots, they would apply pressure to them in due time, sending their friendship into a vicious spiral, leering in flames, piss, vinegar. People, it was people who were tiring. Average fucking people. People in power, ego, pride, malice, the toilet bowl of human civilization. And this all he had to do in the grips of such a depression was drink and go walking through the streets, empty in the early morning hours, the rats coming out to feed and hide inside the engine blocks, soaking in the warmth, hiding from the rain. His mind wandered, ruminations of America, visions of old city streets rushing back to him from his mind, the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle in the early 2000s, before the nail in the coffin and the end of affordable apartments. Artists were pushed further away from the city center, scrambling to places like Beacon Hill and Finney Ridge, the top of Queen Anne. Many artists had moved away entirely to shitholes like Portland and Los Angeles, the outskirts of Minneapolis and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Cheap rent, good people. What more could they ask for? Life was short. Some of the brazen took to buying up foreclosed homes in Detroit. He heard reports of violence, at one point considering following forth and moving to the city his grandfather had lived in. A man too named John Kowalski, living in a boarding house and enduring cold winters with the flu. John Jr. had read his old journal covering his time in Detroit, and it sounded almost romantic in that age. The local swimming pool and atrium, containing many rare and beautiful plants, thriving in the humidity. He attended plays and went to the cinema. Detroit in 1929, the year before the crash. He had avoided the war, never a man of violence. He had a stare stern enough to keep most from ever laying a finger on him. He was something about the look in his eyes, something that said he was prepared to go all the way to the edge. He recalled an incident in Seattle where the crowd who lived below had encountered him and his ex-wife keying into their apartment. One of the snots had made a remark about his wife's ass. She seized up immediately, herself a victim of childhood sexual trauma. He had seized the young man by his collar, pulling him toward himself and pushing a cigarette hard into his neck until it burned hard and deep and he wallowed in pain. The crowd of his friends too chicken to do anything. He calmly keyed in with his wife. It was early on a Saturday morning. He sat sipping espresso on the patio, reading the morning sun. He had been recalling living at a halfway house back in the States, where he and all his roommates would take to sleeping on the floors, comforted to be sleeping on the ground or used to it from being in jail or on the street. He hated these stale memories, like weak old potato chips and rotten grapes. He had noticed his drinking had began to subside the longer he spent in Santorini. What it was, he was not sure. It had simply become less of a necessity. He didn't need a crutch in paradise, and to the captain, Santorini was heaven compared to the valley of the Moon Park neighborhood where drunks would fight in front of his grandmother's house. Drunken Indians, men you can never bring yourself to hate, no matter how hard their quandary, functional or dysfunctional. That had been the mantra of his childhood. There was no in-between. There was no middle anything, succumbing to supreme highs and lows. Tensions between his parents had been high then, often arguing late in the night, keeping him and his brother awake, his mother grabbing her bag and the keys to the truck and leaving at midnight, off to a hotel destined to return days later or the following morning. The hours went by like days with her gone, he and his brother peeking their ears at passing cars, thinking she had arrived home again. Luckily, she never left for good, although he was sure it had crossed her mind many times. A child of native boarding school, she had been through the ringer. He and his brother would not come to understand this until later in their adult life, confused by her anger and sometimes prone to becoming a victim of her violence, whether verbal or physical. And thus, he was so far from there. These stale memories he scattered to the wind, lying in an incense, not yet having located any sage in town, and as it was only likely to, in some boutique filled with crystals and rose quartz, hemp backpacks made in Nepal, essential oils, and New Age works. New Age was a strange concept to John, his people followers at one time of ancient medicine. He had risen from that ash to walk the earth bearing charms and sweet prayers, doing his best to walk the red road whenever he could, although he could not commit to breaking his secret pact with the spirits in the bottle. He had vowed to drink himself to death years ago, yet here he was, alive, becoming unshackled from the odd slurps which powered him through each day and early into morning, sleeping late on his days off, getting up and puking as he walked to work, and when it was time to report. It wasn't until he had puked up the previous night's bile that he could relish in a morning cigarette and a hot cup of black coffee. Painting was therapeutic for him compared to being stuck in the bridge of a seafaring cargo vessel in the high seas amidst the tip of South Africa, the South Atlantic, bitter and unforgiving, the waters teeming with sharks. It was no cape one would want to be swallowed into. Death was almost certain, and the current vile and unforgiving. All was a roll of the dice, nobody in charge. We're all wired into each other somehow on this sickening human frequency, forever destined to be completely alike and opposite each other. Forgiving and unforgiving, the plight of sacred daily rapture. He was at a local flea market digging through old boxes when he came across a 1975 copy of the Big Book. He chuckled, adding it to his basket. That week news had come down the islands and over the airways of a political ban on protests. People had taken to the street of Athens armed with stones and burning wine bottles. Thera had its own speed. It had its own local resistance. They remained calm and hushed, publishing a monthly paper and spending most of their time drinking wine and complaining about the status quo. These were working people who were loyal with their cause of maintaining their sense of community. To the captain, this was the most relishing factor, alongside his admiration on reports of darknet hackers from Greece who had crashed a Russian power station in deep Siberia. The captain was well aware of Bill W.'s love of psychedelics. He had quit drinking before in his late 30s, shacked up with a lady of the night who he had a vicious argument with a night after him drinking shoju and condemning her humanity, an argument which had gone nuclear when she admitted to having no shame about her work. Their time together had been cinematic and surreal, having met on a dating site. Even all these years later, he could still hear her voice. "You're never going to quit drinking." That night he did not drink, instead eating several grams of psilocybin, this time in a sober state of mind. Christ, he thought, he was free. Oh, what a redeeming feeling to be free. Like finding gummy worms under the rainbow. Christ, he thought, some people, average fucking people he called them, even worse, self-proclaimed geniuses, the educated, the absolute astute little cocksuckers of a losing age, downfall, knew nothing of freedom's value. It was dawn, the city streets wide and empty. He had grown to love this hour, once hating it at old jobs. He washed the Belletti free of grounds and sat with his legs dangling down through the patio, void of furniture aside from a monkey tree an old gay man had given him across the hall, various young men forever coming to and fro from his flat, always greeting him in a robe, in his apartment a wall of smoke, a John Lennon B-side or funkadelic track blasting in the middle of the day. He played all types of music, and by nightfall all he could do was snuggle up with Chopin, Brian Eno, Debussy, the godfather of ambient music. He laughed, the coffee and squeef cheering him up, having just eaten several RSO tablets. He didn't fly anywhere without them. He picked up his Walkman, the mixtape cued and set up the night prior for this exact moment. He took a long toke and then leaned back, 4 non-blondes blasting in his eardrums. He had let go of the few and far between friends of old, hating short-lived relationships with coworkers, exhausting and incompetent. Suddenly there came a soft knock on his door. He was not to go out till later, not needed at work that day. He was greeted by a tall Chinese man, the man gesturing for his need to enter his home, to speak about private matters. The captain's heart rate went up. The man sitting in the lone chair in the flat. The captain stood nervously, chain smoking. The Chinese man had been quiet. He was simply there to tie things up for the Chinese on paper. They had decided to let him live, at odds without him ever since his departure. They were smart to watch their asses and have him sign a statement to conceal his secrecy on matters within the organization that would see him quickly killed. He was surprised the man was not there to carry out a hit. He was half Chinese, half Venezuelan. He worked with many of the crime rings English-speaking clients, utilizing torture as well as carrying out assassinations. Luckily, this was only a protective measure by the mob to keep a lid on things, lest someone quit, taking the dirt on the operation with them as small talk at their next gig. After the mob representative left, the captain fell into a deep dream. Deep in his sleep, he was with his old lover clambering a sequoia pitfall while bushwhacking in the redwoods, angelic blades of light cutting into the canopy. Often he dreamed of an island which had many microclimates. There was a train running down the heart of the island, a train he would sometimes engineer, while most of the time just a measly passenger, being pursued by an unknown yet brooding force. Then there were the nights in which he rode with his old and new lovers alike, past and future. When he awoke, he had missed a call from work. He had missed out on an opportunity for overtime. His boss, Costos, was built of stones and burning paper, resembling an olive-toned Albert Einstein. His hair a maniacal display as if he had stuck his cock in a light socket. He ran 2 crews, dropping in frequently to make sure his customers' needs were being met. A perfectionist, standing in his stained white Carhartts and adorned in an Irish sweater vest. The captain called Costos, receiving a voicemail in the second ring. He told himself the act of calling proved he was worth his salt. Truthfully, were he worth his salt, he would have been awake earlier to receive the call. Instead, he had been in bed sleeping off a hangover. Bosses had long smelled the booze on the captain a mile away, yet could never forget his exemplary work ethic and loyalty to his crewmates. Respect was the only currency these men truly compiled. The captain fit right in. Besides, he thought, Costos certainly enjoyed a snort or two. We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. Quote by Plato. The captain was a child of night, servant of day. He had money. Money itself didn't need structure. He needed structure, lest he succumb to his own demons, running aloof and hearing voices within his own self-imposed psychosis. It was an agony. Yesterday was nothing but smoky walls of punk rock infected with the germs of pop music. These were acidic times for Generation X burnouts, swallowed by the scorn of millennials confused about what bathroom to use. A generation raised on the internet. The childhood internet the captain remembered was CB radio in the village, chattering day and night, the sacred CB, connecting friends and lovers in the village before cell phones and computers and phones that turned into computers. In the village, kids used to box each other to see what they were made of. Those days were gone, citing bullying by figures and crybabies in power. He dipped the roller into the paint tray and raised up a cream-coated brush, swathing the walls of the island's finest, the most astute and world-traveling patrons from overseas and Greek millionaires alike, the seasoned and jet-lagged assholes of today, tomorrow, and the morning after. Friendships had become alien to the captain. He had spent his life at sea and rode from one scraggly hotel to motel when spending his time on land. When spending his time on land. It had been over a decade since he had lived on land for longer than being docked for repairs. Smuggling had no off-season, and the supplier was not able to meet demand. Lest the supplier was not able to meet demand. This had always caused friction with the superiors to which he reported. When they weren't making a profit on a haul, there was an added tension in the air, knuckles cracking, teeth grinding. His coworker Angelos had finally warmed up to Kowalski, the sole Alaska native Pollock, as the captain liked to surmise. Angelos was filled with questions about America. To him, America was in the trash of stock photos and ill-informed history books. He imagined that everyone in America owned a house and had a dog like Lassie, a mother like Audrey Hepburn, a father like James Dean, white picket fences, razor blades. To Angelos, this was the frameworks of the American dream. The captain and he had a great deal to speak of, the captain dismantling the illy conceived notion that every American was wealthy. Angelos needed to understand it was freedom which made America undeniable and all that was her everlasting inner strife. Thus the machines of night burned away, Headline news, mongering conveyor belt of rancid fear, lies, ever poignant control mechanism of corporate news outlet doom, marketing fear by the mouthful and tweaking the paranoia. After work, Angelus and the captain went out for a drink, a shot of ouzo and a Heineken. Angelos drank fast, plowing through rounds until visibly shit-faced, the captain forever pacing himself and merely puking in the morning to start the day off with vigor. He bid his friend good night, climbing onto his bicycle and making his way home through the winding streets. He had some uphill travel to sweat out the booze and was excited as he pedaled, remembering that he had received an order of shrooms in the mail from the dark web. Psilocybin taffy separated into grams. The supply would last him 9 months. He was grateful. The captain recalled his grandmother falling asleep in front of the fire, her head atop her arm and no blanket, the crackling stove lulling her in sweet lullabies of her youth, nostalgia and euphoria fading fast. She was gone now, visiting him in circling eagles. He had been cooped up for far too long. The only time he ventured out and about was on his days off to an antique shop he was furnishing his apartment through. His flat was slowly coming to life. One night, he discovered a 1950s solid steel Formica top beauty. The table was pink with the legs attached. Somehow, some way, he carried it 5 blocks back to his apartment building, taking it apart, nearly breaking the glass on the front door. He had been half crocked, using ouzo muscles and adrenaline to get the solid steel table home. Curbside service, one man's trash, another man's treasure. Over time, the apartment walls began to become filled with beautiful pieces of art from the flea market. It was a slow and laboring task to get the apartment feeling cozy. At times, he had needed to borrow a dolly, which the shop owner owned several of, to loan to their customers. The many in town did not drive, the heart of the city compact and void of most motor vehicle traffic. He sat midday at a cafe around the corner from his flat when he looked up from his book to sight the woman he had been watching come home from work. She was sipping espresso, lipsticks on the tiny white cup. She was reading a copy of A Wrinkle in Time, likely revisiting the book he noticed was in English. He immediately wanted to flee, feeling unkempt and oily in the muggy Aegean afternoon. The sky was electric blue. Suddenly her eyes feeling him upon her, he quickly turned away, returning to his journal. The last thing he was ever good at was trying to reel in a beautiful woman who stuck around long enough to see him turn into a butterfly. They tolerated his drunken antics for as long as they could, until they kicked the skillet from the fire and rubbed his heart in glass. He cursed himself, waving at a waiter. He sent a drink to her table. Quickly he got up, walked into the cafe and paid his bill. He thought it awkward to have her look over at him. He had no expectations and was in no means desperate. That evening around 11:30 p.m., as the sun was beginning to set, he decided he would eat 2 grams of mushroom taffy. Around 10 p.m., the trip was in full bore, and the captain feeling the walls of his apartment come to life. The amplified voices of his neighbors and sound of rain pattering on the roof. The carpet began to morph into life, the Iranian fabric glowing like a river of bouillon. He lit a dunghill and slowly reached for his shoes. The night was young. He took to the streets to lead him to a good vantage point of the sea. Finally, he came to a bench in a tiny park on one side of which sat 2 lovers playing suck-face. He had a fresh pack of smokes and a water bottle of white wine on ice. The Aegean Sea highlighted the gleam of the moon. The midnight air was alive with human vibrations and filled with swirling ghosts. He thought back to earlier in the day, buying that woman a drink and chickening out on trying to start a conversation were downright embarrassing. He chased women chasing him, and this is how it had always been. He was lost in the constellations, the light pollution low enough to see the night sky come to life. He breathed deep, reaching for a dunghill, and looking up to notice a figure taking a seat at the bench across from his, facing the sea and empty. Tourists moseying about, Americans being drunk and disorderly, Brits on holiday. It was her, the woman from the block, his block, and spotted earlier at the restaurant. Christ, now he was drunk and peeking. Hello, please don't find this creepy, but I happen to be the guy who ordered you a drink earlier. I was wondering what your name was. My name is John Kowalski. She seemed moderately creeped out, yet they were in a highly populated area and the captain appearing to be too fucked up to possibly harm anyone. His pupils were saucers in the glow of the streetlight. She asked him, "Are you tripping?" John laughed, a deep guttural laugh. He laughed with his whole body. "My name is Yvette. You crack me up." She pulled out a spliff, rolled with a king-size paper. "Smoke with me, senor?" She patted the bench next to her. "Don't worry, it's safe." He got up slowly, the muscles in his back strained. He offered her a snort from his water bottle, to which she gladly accepted. She was holding, producing mini bottles of Jameson. The two smoked together until the captain's eyes looked like Mr. Miyagi. Yvette had proven herself a seasoned pothead. She smoked Lucky Strike cigarettes and kept them in her sterling silver cigarette holder. No woman had ever been able to keep up with his drinking and smoking, and he sensed a coming storm. He was not ready to enter a relationship founded in vices. He sought true love. He could not fuck this thing up. Yvette had a cackle to her, and she and Kowalski were soon ruining the experience for their other lovers in the park. One couple getting up and leaving while holding their noses from the cigarette smoke wafting downhill. The captain had hollered, "Oh, you'll be all right." They had quickly turned into obnoxious Americans and were burning their reputations with their neighbors, the two of them seeming to have found each other as if searching their entire lives. Each piece of Yvette the captain got to unveil, increasing his attraction to her. She had her own guard, she too suffering in past relationships. She was a decade older than he, a described cougar. She knew she still had it, even after all these years, through graying hair to grayed hair. The captain felt lost in the wonder of her shape and the softness of her spirit. Her aura was beaming in an angelic yellow, and he found himself absorbed in her current. She was mixed like him, her father black and Cheyenne, and her mother white. She knew all too well the stresses of walking in two worlds, and did her best to make the best of it. Unfortunately, like the captain, the only way she could seem to function was from within a booze-stricken fog. They carried the burden of death on their own lives, losing those most dear to them. They finally grew chilly as the rain returned, and they headed back toward their dwellings. The captain and Yvette had finally met. He had put her contact info into his phone outside her flat as he bid her goodnight. He applied no pressure, turning and walking away. She was relieved. She too had paid her prices and wasn't about to spread her legs for just anyone. Certainly not anyone she was vying to take seriously. She liked John, his laugh filling up the space between the earth and the sun. From the looks of him, he was just another grumpy 42-year-old male. The disdain for life people saw in him a red flag. Beneath the scowl was a laugh. This shell had been his protection. Nobody needed to know he had the heart of a bird. Fluttering and boxing the walls of his breastplate, he ruffled his chest feathers, trying to hide the little boy in him who was still beat up and battered by the tribulations of a hard-lived life. Yvette worked in broadcasting as a translator, where she made good money and was continually challenged in her work, whereas many other jobs left her feeling stale. You have to consider the level of weird you are willing to tolerate when considering getting involved with a neighbor should things statistically fall below par. The captain awoke the next morning feeling like every toilet in Hong Kong had been flushed into his head, a victim of cheap white wine. He preferred red blends in boxes, returning serendipitously to the bladder for refills, carrying him through the night into the early morning. He felt the beaming euphoria seeping within his core and radiating his spinal cord like an electrical current, his chi boiling. Such was the feeling after a hearty mushroom journey. He began to recall the previous night's events as he stood in front of the Belletti, waiting for it to percolate. He slowly pulled out his phone, convinced Yvette had been a spirit. He had seen spirits while tripping before, recalling an old man in the kitchen, the floor covered in spiders. His friend informed him the next morning an old man had lived in that cottage for 30 years. The ghost had seemed lonely. Yet Yvette was no spirit, as his phone revealed, and he was both terrified and elated all at once. He had shared a piece of his soul with another human being, and know how lovely it all felt. Besides, he feared his balls would turn into marbles in due time. He laughed at himself for not having been laid in over 2 years. He struck a paper match, raising it to his dunghill, taking a long drag. He exhaled and calmly set the cigarette in the ashtray, walking into the bathroom and beginning to vomit, sounding like a 12th century samurai committing seppuku. He flushed the toilet, returning to his cigarette and adding more Kahlua to his coffee and another ounce of milk. Good God, some night, he thought. His spirit felt free, light, void of all sorrow. He recalled the sound of his basset hound howling to the sound of sirens as the ambulances painted the streets below. Living in the old brothel, it was a wonder he never fell dead from the roof, climbing the rusted ladder to where he had set up a tent, weighted with cinder blocks he hauled up in one arm. When his ex-wife and he fought, he would sleep on the roof of 713 East Pike Street, the heart of the nightlife carrying on below into morning, the 2 a.m. scramble, closing bars and climbing into cabs. Clean was the wake of his spirit that morning, wishing to hang in that moment forever. After his second cup of Kahlua and espresso and a dose of Klonopin, he picked up his phone, writing the following to Yvette. Thank you for the laughs. Kowalski had asked Yvette out for dinner that morning, and he was preparing to meet her. It was about 5:30 p.m. and he sat in his apartment trying desperately to rub one out, his brow awash in sweat. One could never be too sure. Maybe he would get lucky, and thus he needed to be prepared. He finished, sighing a breath of relief and cleaning up his mess. He felt like his nerves were spinning in a blender in the kitchen of a burning house. He took in a huge gulp of Aegean's air, trying to lower his heart rate. He made his way to the door, then stopped, beelining it for the bathroom and vomiting violently. Keep it together, he told himself. This feeling was not eternal. He headed out the door, the cafe just several blocks from his flat, with a full bar and heavenly appetizers. She was wearing a Oaxacan dress, her dreadlocks pulled back, her skin a rich caramel brown. She wore subtle blue eyeshadow, lipstick, and a dash of eyeliner, her natural beauty radiating forth, a force of Athena and the personification of wisdom. He was humbled in her presence, a goddess amongst heathens. The waiter greeted them, pouring some wine and taking requests from the bar. Yvette finally asked, "So what do you do for a living?" The captain was taken aback, not wishing to go down memory lane. He replied, "I work on a painting crew to earn a couple bucks. I'm mostly retired." The topic was the seed of miscontent. They finished up their drinks and headed for Mesariah's cemetery. Yvette produced a bottle of vino from her purse, slipping it into a brown bag, the two sitting on benches next to a lone cypress. The captain had brought some RSO capsules along, and the two had eaten one, waiting for the effects to peak into high gear. As the sun said goodnight, a chill washed over the graveyard, and the captain wrapped Yvette in his thick Woolrich flannel. "Money poor, Woolrich," he joked. Kowalski had discovered that Yvette was an agnostic. This had always proved trying. Her cackle carried through the city streets as they headed toward the bar, frequented by Yvette. The inside of it was set up exactly like Frodo Baggins' house, complete with a pipe-smoking bartender. It was mildly populated for a Thursday night, mainly visited by locals. The street entrance set up like a speakeasy. It was a hearty buffer from the tourists beyond the walls, their cameras raised toward the sky, stomachs filled with sardines and lamb, yogurt, all destined to be shit out by mid-morning. The bar was known for strong rum drinks, and the two of them sat in a dark corner sipping blue Hawaiians, prodding each other, trying to feel one another out. The two of them each still had certain guards in place. By 2 a.m. they were in the sack, attacking each other's faces in violent kisses and tangled legs. The two finished, each getting their cookies, Kowalski reaching for his Dunhills, and Yvette taking a long drag off her Lucky Strike. "You know, it's been about 2 years since I made love." Yvette coughed on a hit from her small bong, handing it to Kowalski. "Glad to be of service, you poor thing," she giggled, coughing and walking towards the bathroom to pee. She hollered, "You want a beer, John?" He was parched. "I'd love one." She returned with 2 Peronis and an opium pipe. She took a seat in bed next to him, the two of them sitting up, the room muggy and reeking of stale sex. Yvette took a long toke on her pipe, handing it to the captain. He declined. "I slayed that dragon, honey." She shrugged, placing it on the bedside table. The next morning he set to raiding the fridge, discovering that Yvette was a vegetarian. He sliced some bread for their toaster and into an avocado. Next he set to frying 2 eggs and eating some vegetarian sausage. Space food, as he called it. He found a tray and poured some orange juice. He had been as quiet as a shrew eating toilet paper. He entered the bathroom, Yvette raising her head and wiping the crust from her eyes. She reached for her glasses, smiling. "What time is it?" she asked. Kowalski set the tray down. "It's 9:30, he replied. She yawned hard and deep, knowing her breath smelled horrible. She knew a man like John, as shy as he was, likely to crawl through a sewer if it meant at the end he got to take a shower and get laid. He sparked a Dunhill sitting in the Victorian armchair, naked and gazing into the deserted streets below. He felt free of burdens and debts, grief, shame, like someone had hit the restart button. The two shared breakfast, Yvette needing his help. She had smiled. "I have a crush on you," she said. He desperately wanted to keep her from meeting the monster in his basement, chained to a wall and deprived of all sin. Relationships he had forgotten, meant work, a lot of work, commitment, and bound by the laws of love. Was this what he wanted? Once more, the whole thing was a mixed bag. He kept it light, not wanting to ruin a special moment. It was his mind which forever wandered into the dreariest of tombs. He felt like half his mind was reminiscent of a city dump. He finally got dressed, needing to return home to water his plants, particularly worried about the geraniums he had on his balcony, pierced by the blazing sun. He needed a long drink of cool Santorini tap water. Vet was showering and needed to work on her artist residence application. She regarded her employment in broadcasting as merely a day job. Her true passion was in beading and sewing. She did everything from native necklaces to cutting her own unique dresses inspired by dashikis and buckskin. She worked in almost all forms of media and even had a large-scale compilation of her own musical explorations on cassette machines and computers alike. She reminded him of Chan Marshall mixed with Chaka Khan. Throw in some Beth Gibbons and you had yourself an Yvette. He chuckled to himself. He liked her. She didn't put pressure on him. He was able to breathe around her. She appreciated silence just as much as he, something he had longed for in women. Silence without sadness. It took a certain type of brain to feel that wanted silence. To some of it is maddening, inner strife bubbling to the surface, shocking the spinal cord like an ice bath in the asylums of yesteryear. The continual need to fill up empty space with garbage. He felt it in inherently Anglo-Saxon inferiority. He wasn't willing to paint any pictures, however. He had dated white women most of his entire life, and now he had met his match. Yvette had dated white men most of her life. Her parents shipped her off to boarding school to prevent her from succumbing to the life of a village kid with no future, rotting away in front of the Xbox while the elders' houses have no stockade of wood and not nearly enough sheefish in the freezer to get through winter. The next few weeks, the two began to spend more and more time together, the captain soon spending most of his nights at Yvette's. She had a cat that would sleep atop his head and purr into his chest, slowly butting his head. Cats were like women. They required special attention. Yvette had found it difficult to concentrate on her art since meeting Kowalski, and she had put many of her artistic endeavors to the side. She had lost good men before to becoming absorbed in her work, to the point it's all she slept and breathed, neglecting her partner's needs entirely. She wished to abstain from art for the time being. It had been her Achilles' heel. One might say she was married to her work. Yvette had a massive collection of vinyl, everything from Screamin' Jay Hawkins to Bill Fay, and held many a collector's item records, from the blue bag edition of Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, and one-off records like The Priest They Call Him on 7-inch by Kurt Cobain and William S. Burroughs. John offered time and time again to head back to his place so she could get some work done, but she never bit, not now at least. What was art anyway? A need for acceptance? What is said of the artist who creates in secret, sharing their work with no one? He felt tired just trying to deconstruct it within the caverns of his mind. He longed to be watching a crappy movie and eating some greasy food. Yvette's recent piece was a mummy hanging on a noose, recorded on Super 8 film, and displayed in slow motion over one of her droning and distorted analog guitar soundscapes. Layers of guitars with subtle theremin work. It was her self-proclaimed masterpiece, some 9 odd minutes of drone on a tube amp cranked up full volume. The Fender a Jaguar set up with twin enforcer humbuckers. They growled, pushing the Vox amplifier into her widest reach. The two tracks were bowed guitars. She could never outdo herself. There had been a blurb about her in a British paper, her work reminding the music director of Wada from Japanese droners Boris. They had no idea she had met Wada and spent an afternoon drinking together. She was just 20 then, and now waning into her early 50s. He and Yvette would go on to share more than just space, but each other's darkest secrets. Kowalski was finally at one with the spirits and been given his ticket to love, eventually proposing to Yvette, embalmed in yearning. Fearless for their futures and walking out onto limbs most people would never dare. They each had very few friends and a few remaining family. Given the speed at which their love had sown itself, what better place to have a wedding but in Vegas? They laughed and laughed, completely serious. Most Alaskans were fiends for the Strip, gambling up their fishing money or on break from an oil rig in mid-February. Yvette was a black sheep, her parents both deceased. She was not one for a white wedding, and thankful John could arrange such a low-key wedding. His friend Spencer had taken up residence on an old rundown farm. The ex-punk rocker turned beekeeper, and he had let Kowalski know they could take up residence on their acreage, packing a tent and outdoor supplies. Their honeymoon anything but one of those floating shacks in Bali. The two of them each had been homeless in their lives. They could care less. They were just grateful to have a home. The two loved camping nonetheless and had traveled all over the world. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, yet eventually all came to a head. He trusted his gut. The two had a wedding ceremony arranged on a private roof with an open bar, the umbrella pulling at the steel buckets of ice. The party already set up, the cooking done by Kowalski's brother. Each table had a basket of pot brownies. The crowd a mixture of musicians and dear friends. A very small and quaint gathering. There was no need for a DJ. The two decided to keep it mellow. 20-odd people, seated around several folding tables. Slow Tejano streamed out over the PA speakers. Kowalski's longtime Jewish lawyer, DT, DJing off his phone. The two had denied all gifts, instead asking that their guests donate a minimum of $100 to the MMIW movement, an organization standing for the voices of murdered and missing Native American women. There was no Hollywood goodbye. The two merely snuck out the next morning, off to Hawaii and saying goodbye to the baking Nevada sun. Dry heat hammering you down into the gutter where you were likely to find the pieces of yourself you came to the city with in the first place. Kowalski's friends lived on what was once a small coffee plantation. It was perfect. They owned many acres surrounding the area, one area of which was dedicated to mota production and harvesting, something Kowalski had not shared with Yvette. The two awoke groggily the next morning, tired from travel. They would spend several weeks there, and thus no rush to be on with the day. There was even an outdoor shower. The spot was the backpacker's dream. The beach was 15 minutes away, and you could feel her mist in the stark humidity, the smell of salt, birds of paradise thriving in front of the lanai. This was one of many adventures they had yet to have. Signing up to travel down the Grand Canyon, the waiting list several years long. Yvette carved into her papaya with lime, and Kowalski wished he could freeze frame this moment and hang in it forever. That night, while making love, Kowalski had discovered a lump in Yvette's breast, going limp instantly and feeling a chill tumble down his spine. This had thrown a wrench into their vacation entirely. Kowalski insisting they go to a local hospital for an exam, and Yvette insisting she wait until they returned and she could use her insurance. John had been angry, not wanting to go down this road. That night he had held her the entire evening, the fear of God striking a fire under his ass. Yvette woke up, her eyes gazing right into Kowalski's, who sat watching her sleep. I have a doctor, John. Don't worry. There's nothing they can do for me here. He knew she was right. He sighed a breath of relief and lit another cigarette, running his hands through his hair. She joked, "Repeat after me. I fear nothing, from fear and loathing." And she laid his head to rest. So he laid his head to rest, his blood pressure slowly dropping, muscles relaxing. He kissed Yvette softly on her cheek, wrapping his arms around her. The two mummified like that in their zipped-together sleeping bags. With the rain fly off, the night sky radiated the cosmic gems of night, ancient stars. He looked to the moon, knowing his ancestors were looking back down at him. He smiled, feeling full, comforted by ghosts. Yvette would be okay, and so would he for that matter. Not all was left up to the magic 8-ball. His eyes closed, fading, and finally fast asleep, exhausted.